funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.
You're listening to Programme 2 of the three-part series Making a Difference. Over the years, many Irish missionary women have done Trojan work in various faraway lands. This is a few of their stories.
The job of a missionary is to work alongside of the people that they go to be companions.
I just wanted to go out to Africa to help them, the people to help themselves.
I felt it was to respond, to go out from my own country, to give myself to other people, for other people. Maybe you could call it love.
Love is the language understood by all. The people really, really appreciated that we cared about them.
In the year 1958, Sister Deirdre Toomey of the Medical Missionaries of Mary arrived as a newly qualified doctor into Nigeria from Ireland in order to work in a mission hospital there. So just how challenging was the work?
After I'd been there 2 or 3 weeks, Dr. Godfrey Hines needed a break. He went away for 2 weeks. And the very day after he left, I really learnt how to be brave, because in the morning a little girl came in with a strangulated hernia, which is unusual in children, and she was pretty serious, and the lovely girls in the theatre helped me to get through that procedure. Then the next one that came in that same morning was a woman with an ectopic pregnancy, so we got through that. And then the third one of that first day was an elderly lady who'd been hit by a car and her leg was torn all the way down the side. I remember the bleeding was horrific. So she'd been getting her blood and somebody was trying to stop the bleeding until we got her into the theatre. Well, the first little girl did really well and she recovered, which I believe with a strangulated hernia for a section was very unusual. And the next lady, the ectopic lady, she recovered, but sadly the elderly woman died that day. I was sad, but that evening I remember saying, I won't be afraid again. You know, with the wonderful people in theatre, I'd managed to face a difficult day. You could rely on everybody around you to keep you going and to keep you on the right road.
And over the next few years, Deirdre fell in love with her work as a missionary doctor in Nigeria.
But we were young then. We were young. It made a big difference. Full of enthusiasm, yes. I loved what I was doing.
And what did you love most about it? I mean, it's very obvious.
I loved the maternity work, so later on I was allowed to specialise in that. So I loved to be in the maternity wards and the labour ward. The joy of a new baby arriving in the world, you know, and getting them through safely. It was a great life.
And although Deirdre loved doctoring, in particular maternity work, nevertheless she often had to contend with many difficult cases.
Sometimes because of distance and bad roads and poor transport facilities in those days. Now things have changed hugely, you know, now. But in those days it was difficult to get out of some of the villages for a woman in labour. So if she didn't get out early, there'd be complications. Maybe the baby's head would be stuck, or maybe she'd be bleeding or needing an operation, and, you know, she might arrive rather late. The uterus can be damaged or even ruptured, we say broken, and that is a very dangerous situation.
Right. So you had to try and deal with it as quickly and as professionally as possible.
Yes, and we would. And everybody in the team knew that. In the theatre there was what we called a pack system, so we could be ready in about between 7 and 10 minutes we'd be ready. So that was great.
Wow, so you had good procedures and good systems set up, you know, that we're going to deal with this head on when it comes in and no messing around.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And then leave the theatre ready for the next one before we'd go back to the house, so that we'd always be ready.
In July 1967, the Nigerian Civil War, commonly known as the Biafran War, broke out. The war was fought between the Nigerian government and the breakaway state of Biafra. So just how did Deirdre Toomey and her hospital colleagues react to the crisis?
Well, we were advised to come home, because they said expatriates could go back to their own countries. But we didn't think of it because we had so many wounded soldiers, wounded civilians, and a lot of ordinary village people who were sick anyway, and operations needing to be done. So we didn't plan to go, but we just reduced our numbers from 9 down to 6 at that point. One sister was a bit elderly, another one was a little, less able to stay, and so on. So 3 came home and 6 of us remained, and the work continued. But we carried on working while we could hear once the war began, we could hear the sounds of the shelling, and the bombing came nearer and nearer, as it got nearer to our part of the country. But we didn't really expect them to come the way they did. We thought they would come down the road, and we were kind of looking up the road where the fighting was 20 miles away. We thought we were still okay for some more days. But they surprised us by crossing over a river, the Big Cross River, and that was only 3 miles from the hospital. So we were totally surprised by their arrival one morning at 8 o'clock.
This would have been the federal troops of the Nigerian government have come in against the rebel forces, the Biafran forces. Civil war is at full tilt, and you're in the middle of it.
Yes, we were in the wards, and we had to hide under the beds, and the patients also were under the beds because, the falling roof might fall in. The pilots, I think, were Israeli, but they were very accurate. We had previously been told to cover the roofs of the hospital with red crosses, but after a while we gathered that the Red Cross was more not something to avoid, it was something for target, because there would be a lot of military people in the wards. But so we put palm branches, all the workers put palm branches over all the roofs, and that's one way they were trying to keep the hospital safe.
So how arduous was Deirdre's workload during these days of living dangerously?
Well, I do remember working one 24-hour. That was during the rough part of the war, and a lady was brought into us with a ruptured uterus, and that is in obstetrics a very dangerous situation. And there were 2 youngsters still around. Some of them had gone back to their family homes, but there were 2 girls that were with me, and I said to them, now the Aries were likely to take on again in the afternoon. I said, will you promise to stay with me if there's an air raid? Don't leave this poor woman who's going to die unless we help her now. So they both said they would stay, that I shouldn't worry, they would stay with me. So we got through the operation actually, and there wasn't any raid that afternoon. And the lady recovered, but I don't have the long time follow-up, of course. That was in the middle of all the disturbances. But that was a scary day. We'd creep down in the dark and change the drips, put up more blood, whatever was needed, and then creep back to the convent again, hiding under a table. Well, that went on for 3 days. On the 3rd day, they actually came closer and said, if you don't come out, we're shooting into the house. So we were now about 12 of us sort of squeezed into that room. And our doctor again, Dr. Godfrey Hines, he came out first waving his stethoscope and a white handkerchief, the stethoscope to prove that he wasn't a mercenary or something. And so he said, we're here. They said, are there any more missionaries around? And we had to lead them then to the Catholic mission, where Father Rory O'Brien was there with an Igbo priest who now is actually our bishop. So they came out, and that group all together with 4 other sisters from a Nigerian congregation, the handmaids, we were then marched down 3 miles to the beach in the dark. And along the road it was sad because there were bodies of soldiers that had died in the fighting. So we finally got to the river. They sat us on the bank until they could plan how to get us over the river. Now that was a river boundary of the war, so the other side of that river, if we could get across, we were out of the fighting zone.
Sister, you're on the wrong side of the river. What happened next?
We were taken over in canoes. The river was high, it was April, so it was a pretty good bit of rain. And we got over to the other side, and after a lot of negotiating, well, the army shared their army tins of food with us, if you don't mind. And we appreciated that. And then our leader, the priest in charge, and Dr. Hines, they asked the military, could we move to the nearest Catholic mission? So later that night, actually, we didn't get there till 2 a.m. We arrived at a mission house where there were 2 St. Patrick's fathers, Kiltegan priests, missionaries. And they, of course, it was a great welcome because they'd been bombed the previous week, and we thought that they might be dead, and they thought we might be all dead. So a night of rejoicing.
And veering away from Africa and turning our attention to Asia. In 1976, Sister Patricia Byrne of the Columban Missionary Sisters went to work as a teacher in the then British Crown colony of Hong Kong.
It was all high rises, and you can find yourself looking up and craning your neck at these buildings. But basically, it was very overcrowded. It was very, very overcrowded.
So what school did Patricia teach in?
It was called Leung Sek Chi, and Leung Sek Chi was the name of somebody who actually gave us, it was a government subsidised school, but we had to find a certain amount of money for it, so it was named after the father of the benefactor. And the Leung family, took an interest in the school all along and supported us in the school. It was the first secondary school for girls in this very rather poor low-cost housing area. So it gave an opportunity to young people to have a school in their own area, to go to school there. Most of the students came from around the area.
And Patricia taught in that school for the next few years. So what subjects did she teach?
I was teaching English, and religious education was also a subject, so I taught those 2 subjects. The students were very ranged from it was secondary school, so I taught all of the spectrum more or less over those years. The students, I had done my practice teaching in Mount Sackville, Sister Clooney's school, and comparing Mount Sackville with the kids in Hong Kong, it was quite different. They were very lively, and everybody, if you ask a question in if there's children in that
Mount
school,
Sackville in salubrious South County Dublin.
That's right.
And all of a sudden you're in a less salubrious Hong Kong.
That's right. And if I asked a question there in Mount Sackville, all the hands would go up. Everybody would want to answer. They'd all want to be talking. But when I went to Hong Kong, I noticed, one of the things I noticed very early on was people were very slow to put up their hand, in the sense that if I make a mistake, I probably lose face. So one thing I did notice, if there was ever a figure or a number in the question, they all knew it. All the hands went up. They were very good at numbers and all that kind of thing. But very few hands would go up to answer the question. But the young people, the children there, were very well behaved, I have to say. They were very, it's changed now, I'd say. It's probably different nowadays in some areas, in some places in Hong Kong. But in those days, there's a strong desire for education from their families, no matter how poor they are. Even if they come out of one of those wooden huts that used to be on the hillside, the uniform would be perfect. And so they appreciated education.
So just how challenging was it for Patricia teaching her students?
In many ways, I mean, it's easier with the bright ones. But
of course.
But I didn't have any real preference with the whether they were brighter ones or whether they were weaker ones. In fact, I was more geared towards the weaker ones. I was very conscious of them. I was very conscious because really they were the poor, the poor of Yahweh. They were the poor people. They were the ones who could end up on the margins in terms of where they would go. Would they continue right through school? Would they not? You know, what were the hopes for them?
So it was kind of on a knife edge, and they needed every bit of encouragement possible, because Otherwise, it could go the wrong way.
It could go the wrong way, and they could, you weren't sure, because basically the area they lived in, there could be a lot of problems there. There are usually people who drop out of school.
From the early 1980s onwards, Patricia Byrne joined a group called the Prisoners' Friends Association and began visiting prisons in Hong Kong.
I visited prisons as a volunteer, basically, just going in to visit people, especially those who had no visitors. That was the focus of the group. And so I did visit a number of prisoners for many years. Most of them I visited for a long time. A few of them were in for murder, I'm afraid.
And such work wasn't without its more dramatic moments, especially when on one occasion Patricia arrived into prison just as an escape was in progress.
I was visiting, and just as I arrived to visit, there were great alarm bells going off. Everything was kind of wild. I wasn't allowed in, of course. Somebody had escaped. I think he had got a guard's uniform, had got over the wire, had disappeared. I think he swam across the lake. It was on one of the outlying islands. And of course I was kind of hoping that he probably would make it. But of course he didn't. He was recaptured.
It's that Irish in you. It's the Irish thing, We have such a history of prison escapes,
Yes. But anyway, he was recaptured.
Sister, during your prison visitation, did many of the prisoners say to yourself, why are you, a person originally from Ireland, visiting me, a prisoner here in Hong Kong? Did that question ever posed to you at all?
Maybe not exactly like that, but some would say, like Peter, whom I visited for 30 years, he would say, you're like family. When I go out, I'm going to bring you to China. I'm going to bring you in as part of my family. Peter, unfortunately, sadly, was married with 2 small children when he ended up in prison. But he...
For 30 years?
Yes, 2 small boys. For a while, he actually was more than 30 because he went on the run in China. So he was 2 years running, and then he got 30 years plus to add it on to that 2 years. So that was Peter. But for him, I was like family. It was more, he almost adopt you, your family. And he wasn't the only one who would have said that. Like some of the other guys or some of the other people I visited would also have felt, you're kind of your family. You're taking the place of family. My family can't visit for some reason or another, or don't visit, but you're visiting me, so your family. And kind of amazed that yes, it to a certain extent amazed that you're visiting them, but expressed mainly in being very grateful, being very appreciative. That certainly was my experience, that they would be very appreciative of the visit. To me, the visit or the Christmas card or the letter, all of that was very important. So sometimes the letter, the cards were painful as I tried to write them in Chinese, but they were you try to, it's not easy to communicate by letter with most of them because they really had very little English or none. And so my cards or letters were short, but they always liked to get them. And it's always nice to get a card because your name is called out and you get your card or you get your letter and so on. So that's important for them too.
And getting back to Africa once more. After spending 2 years from 1979 to 1981 working as a midwife in a hospital in the Ugandan capital of Kampala, Sister Maureen Carroll of the Franciscan Missionary Sisters for Africa next went on the missions to Ethiopia.
My new mission in Ethiopia, way out in the countryside. They don't say bush in Ethiopia, it's way out in the countryside, up in the mountains. And I was there from 81 to 1996, 15 years in Ethiopia. And I went and said there was nothing, only a small little, supposed to be a hospital, but it was a very downgraded, terrible condition little hospital. Now I believe, which I'd love to go back and see sometime, beautiful big modern hospital there and roads in. They even have, at the bottom of the mountain, they have an international airport. So things have really grown in Ethiopia since there, thank God. But that time, a woman would have to walk 9 hours for antenatal clinic. So we set up about 45 antenatal clinics. We went to different areas, brought all our medicine, went on the mule if it was too far, or walked and crossed rivers. Afraid of my life in one river when they were flowing, but I enjoyed it immensely. The people were wonderful, very welcoming. It was cold and winter up there on top of the mountains, and a lot of diseases with cold weather because they couldn't wash their clothes, they wouldn't get them dry, damp. But I got one, and they were terrific people. Very friendly, very hospitable, very, very poor.
And as Maureen touched on a short while ago, the big issue she faced in her work was a high rate of death among mothers during birth deliveries.
There were an awful lot of women dying in childbirth, having to walk 9 hours for an antenatal clinic and then walk back. It's no joke. So we started training traditional birth attendants, and these were illiterate women. We made out a chart where they would simply look at their eyes to see if they were anemic, look for pitting oedema in the legs or the hands or the cheeks, whatever. We would put all this simply. Then they put and you could use a toilet roll, the inside of a toilet, the hard core of the toilet roll, and just put it on the body, and you could hear, they couldn't believe it when how that's the baby's heart beating. And then we showed them how to measure. That was to get started there was a problem, because they thought we were here to put them in prison. So many women dying in childbirth, so many, because they no antenatal. They had these traditional birth attendants to deliver the child if it was a normal delivery, but anything else. So we set up these antenatal clinics, and the sister was there. She was not too long there before me, and she was saying they won't make themselves known. They're a bit fearful. But I was only there a week or so, and the other sister was away on retreat or holidays or something, and a knock at the door about 12 o'clock at night. Oh, come, a neighbour, his wife was going to deliver her first baby. So I went down and I said, oh God, I hope I'd be all right. Went down and I examined her, and she was ready to deliver. And she was in labour all day, but I said, all she needs to do is push. Good few pushes and the baby will be out. So, no, they kept rubbing her back and, oh no, don't make her push, she's tired. I said, if she doesn't push now, the baby's going to die because it wants to come out and you have to push and get it out. So, no. So I knew she was all right. All she needed to do was push. She had no complications. Everything else was all right. So I said, well, I can't sit here just waiting for she needs to push, that's all. So I said, if you want me, anything happens, you can call me. So I came away because I knew once they got the assurance that she was all right, then they knew they could manage themselves, and they didn't probably want me around anyway. But the son, who knew I was doing antenatal clinic, said, no, the old granny, the old mother was the birth attendant, and she didn't want anybody to know she was a birth attendant because she thought I might accuse her. But anyway, at 5 o'clock I woke up in the morning. I said, oh, I better go up. Went up. Dead silence everywhere. I said, oh my God, I hope they're all right. And then somebody opened the door. Sister, she delivered just after you left. Baby boy in great form.
So they took your advice after all.
So I was delighted. So that was my entry point in to recognise who delivered her. Oh, my mother delivered her. And though she delivered a lot of children, oh yes, all the people around call her. I said, oh, I'd like to talk to her. And then she said, oh, yeah, there's quite... I said, would you like to learn some more about looking after pregnant women? Because we could teach you. Oh, she said, okay. I said, now, we'll be doing antenatal down in the hospital. On Wednesday, you come down and I'll show you how to examine. And they, oh, yes, told them how to examine the fundus, how many weeks, and how to simply measure from the umbilical cord how many weeks pregnant, the head, and some. Oh, and they were just flabbergasted that they could recognize things. So that was the beginning. So she called more, and then I said, you go and get them, and we'll give them a course, and we'll train them. So that was the first training of traditional birth attendants. We made out a little chart because they were illiterate. And to cut a long story short, that was the beginning of training many traditional birth attendants. And we had 46 clinics, and we would just go once a month. We'd register them with the card, and we identified others, traditional birth attendants. We brought them in for training, and we did the card, but they could tick their thing. And this was their passport for help. If they had attended them and they were into difficulty, they could put them on a mule and bring them into us, and we would bring them down to the hospital. But in no antenatal clinic, we're not responsible for them. They just go to the hospital, and you have to pay the hospital to send the ambulance down. So in
other words, you made the system, in other words, that if you play by our rules, you're going to gain, full stop, in every single way, experience-wise, knowledge-wise, financially as well. I mean, it's a win-win situation right across the board.
If they have no difficulty, we would examine the women every month with them. They would look after them, and usually they say, no, there's no problem there, she should deliver. And then you go the next time, she's there for a vaccine with the little child. So we did great work with that. And then we didn't do community health workers. The government were training community health workers. We said, no, we will stick with the traditional TBAs, as they call them. And before I left, there wasn't one maternal death registered in the last year, a few years before we left. It's really, really, and then the government seen what we were doing, and we handed over the small little centres where we had to, and they made them permanent clinics. So the government was striving to make things better, and eventually, before I left, they had a clinic in all the places where we would go, and the people wouldn't have to work. They'd have a health assistant there, and then they would give them certain medicines.
And to hear more inspirational stories of Irish missionary sisters working in faraway lands, then make sure to catch our next number 3 programme in this 3-part Making a Difference series. From myself, Paul Wright, bye for now.
Funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.